Good morning. This morning's scripture comes from the book of Luke, the 24th chapter, verses 13 through 35. It is printed on the back of your bulletin this morning. It's also on the front screens. It's kind of long. Bear with me. Read aloud if you feel like it. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place here in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was walking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Strange little story. These guys are walking along, talking to each other. Through much of the day of the Sabbath, or at least part of the day of the Sabbath, they're just walking along. They're headed from Jerusalem, and we know where Jerusalem is, and they're headed to Emmaus, and we don't know where Emmaus is, or was, ever. Now, this translation has made a decision, based on some of the ancient manuscripts, that Emmaus was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Some of the other ancient manuscripts have a little bit different reading, which makes it sound like Emmaus was about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and a lot of the early church fathers believed that. 20 miles is a long way when you're on foot, and you'll see how that fits into the story in a minute. You know, people in those days calculated distance based on the Roman army. In fact, in this country, we still do. When the Roman army marched, they considered a pace to be when the same foot hit the ground. So they walked along. That's a pace. That's a pace. That's a pace. That's a pace. Everybody's step was the same length. Everybody's walk was at the same time. One of the ways they scared the heck out of you if you were in another army was when you saw them all with their shields up and their spears or their swords, and they all came at you, and it was like having this great big thing come your way. But our measure of distance, the mile, and by the way, the Latin word for thousand is mille, M-I-L-L-E. And a mile is 1,000 steps. And because those Roman soldiers, every step, every pace, was about 5 feet long, our mile, our 1,000 steps, is just about 5,000 feet long. We still measure the way they measured distance in those days. But these two men, we only know the name of one of them. We know he was not a part of the inner circle of the disciples, because when Jesus' inner circle of disciples is listed, his name is not there. It's the only place he shows up. It's the only place his name shows up. Only one of the two of them is named. Somebody else was not close enough, apparently, to the center of things, namely Jesus, to even get a name in this funny little story. But they're on the way to some place called Emmaus. We know that on the way they were going downhill, because Jerusalem is the highest place around there. And anywhere you go from Jerusalem, you go downhill for a way. And so going to Emmaus is a faster trip than going from Emmaus to Jerusalem. And they're walking along. I really wonder, why on earth would Luke put this particular story in his gospel? Every gospel we know is always written with the idea that when you read the story and you understand the story, you will be convinced that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the one whom God has sent to show God's people, to show all people the way to God. The promised one who will make the world right, the promised one who people have been waiting for in that Jewish tradition at this point for, well, literally 1,000 years or more. And God has promised, and God always keeps his promises, and not everybody agreed that Jesus was the one. And so every gospel is written with the idea of convincing you that Jesus is the one whom God has sent, and that there is a way open to God for everyone because Jesus has been here. Why on earth would you put a little story like this in there? It's a strange story. It's two people who don't appear anywhere else, and they're on the way to some place that we don't know where it is, and they are having a conversation, and somebody joins them on the road. Now, my nomination for the location of that is a town that now or a town that had an Arabic name, and that is Abu Ghash. Abu Ghash is between 7 and 8 miles from Jerusalem. It's downhill. It's sort of in the proper direction. And I was told that by a tour guide during one of those pilgrimages to Israel. So I kind of like Abu Ghash as the place. But they're walking along and they're talking about the biggest news event of their lives, certainly of their existence, because they have been followers of Jesus. They have been part of his group of followers, not on the very inside, but maybe on the next ring around that. And they were really impressed by him, and they believed that he was the one. Then he went to Jerusalem, and in that time, the things that happened got worse and worse and more difficult and more problematic, until finally it ended with his death. An awful death. An embarrassing death. A criminal's death. And it left everybody who had been convinced by him, who was a follower of his, who was a believer in him, it left them all kind of aimless. Maybe these two men were on the way from Jerusalem to Emmaus because they had only come for a while and now they were going to leave. Maybe they were on the way to Emmaus because they were disappointed at the way things had turned out. And that even though some of the people had said, but they were women, some of the people had said that they had seen him after his crucifixion. But none of the rest of them put much stock in that. And so they were walking away. We all have places we'd like to walk away to when things go wrong. Do you have one of those? Some of us walk to the buffet. Some of us walk to the bar. Some of us go to the movie theater. Some of us turn on TV and binge watch somebody else's life and world when ours goes wrong. Oh, good. I see people starting to elbow each other. I guess I'm on the right track here. We all have places that we like to go away to when things are bad. And we go away, and left to themselves, the things don't get any better. And then we go back and we try again. We give it another shot. We do our best. Maybe these guys were on the way to Emmaus because it would help them deal with their sorrow and their upset and their confusion. But they were apparently talking animatedly enough that when this other person came along, he said, "Wow, you guys are really interested in something. What are you so interested in?" And they couldn't imagine that he wouldn't know, because he was coming from Jerusalem too. They could not imagine that he would not have heard about this, because it had been talked about. The fact that Jesus was making a name for himself, the fact that Jesus was saying and doing things that upset a lot of the people in authority, the fact that Jesus had been punished criminally for what he had done, and certainly in a place where everything lived around its religious life among that circle of people, he would know. But he didn't. "Oh, really?" he said. "Tell me about it." And so they told him. They told him about their hopes and expectations that had been raised by this person that they believed had been sent by God, and they told about their disappointment when things went wrong. They told about what they thought might happen because of this person sent by God, and they told about their pain when they realized, they said that nothing was going to be different or better. They told him those things. And he said, "Oh, I think I know who you're talking about." And he started with Moses. And he brought the story right up to the present, and they were amazed at his knowledge. I mean, you talk about trivia. And those, I really do look up things that I think you won't know. And then I say them slowly and with a fairly deep voice, hoping that you will be impressed. You can tell by the response about how often that works. But here was somebody who knew the story better than they knew the story, and they had been living some of the story. They got to where they were going. And what you get here is something that is still the case if you have been in some cultures. The first invitation is a polite invitation, and if you turn it down, it doesn't matter. They said, "Oh, we're here where we're going to stop tonight. Why don't you come in?" And he said, "Oh, no, don't worry about it. I'm going to go on from here." Now, that's a polite exchange. It doesn't mean a doggone thing. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Say yes, you'd surprise them. Say no, no harm done. And then we find out if they really want you to do this. Because they say, "Oh, no, we really mean it. We want you to be here with us. We're glad you're here. Come on in. This is where we're going to stop. We're going to be here for a while. We'd like to listen to you some more. We think you're an interesting person." I'm adding a little to what Luke says, but I think it's all in the proper vein. And he says, "All right." So they go in. Comes time for dinner. I want to pick up a couple of other things on the way. You know, when Jesus appears after the crucifixion and the resurrection, starting on Easter morning, according to John, with Mary in the garden, everybody recognizes him almost immediately. Mary, of course, at first thinks, because she doesn't see him, right? He comes up behind her, and all she hears is the question. And the question is, you looking for somebody? And she thinks he's somebody who works in this place. But that doesn't last more than a few seconds, and he says her name, and she knows who it is. The disciples have locked themselves in the room. They have got the shutters closed. They've got a dresser against the door because they're afraid they're going to be rounded up too. And all of a sudden, Jesus is among them, and there's no question who he is. They know who he is. And when he comes back a little bit later on, immediately, everybody knows who he is. Thomas looks at him and says, "Oh yeah, that's what I was looking for. You got scars." And then when he goes ahead of them into Galilee, we got a story about that too. We got a couple stories about that actually. And he is there, and he is off on the beach someplace, and they are out fishing. They have gone back to the place. It's not the buffet and it's not the bar. For them, it's the boat, because that's what they know how to do. And they're out, and they see somebody gesturing to him. And they don't even need binoculars. I know who that is. But in this story, nobody knows. They walk along. They walk along for a long way. They walk along long enough for him to go all the way through the Old Testament, telling them about the promises of this one who would be sent to them. God's representative, more than God's representative, God. To come to make things right, to come to open a way, to offer forgiveness, to heal, to help, to teach, to show people that way, and to invite everybody, not just the ones who are rich enough to keep every single one of the 613 laws that you have to watch out for if you want to please God. Everybody. Everybody. He's had time to run through that whole list, to summarize all of that stuff, and they still haven't noticed. And they go in, and they're still having a conversation, and they all sit down someplace, and it is only when he puts his hands on the bread and breaks the loaf, that's time for a forward sign. It's you. How could we not know? And he's gone. Now, I don't know any more about how he left them in a hurry than I do about where Emmaus is. But I do know this much, that this is the story in which the risen Christ is with people for a long time, and they don't figure out who he is. But finally they do, and it's because of what he does. Luke has a little bit more in his gospel, and then he stops that, and he adds the second volume, which is the Acts of the Apostles. And the first thing that happens in the Acts of the Apostles is some of Jesus' followers go, and they witness his leaving them again. And I don't know how that happened either. I just know that he was not with them in the same form that he had been as the resurrected Christ. So why does Luke tell us this funny little story? If Jesus has first died and been resurrected and then gone away into heaven, how are you going to find him? How are you going to meet him if you can't see him, if you can't hear him, if you can't understand him? How are you going to know him if you can't encounter him? And here is this funny little story of two guys on the road. And they walk along with someone probably for miles, possibly for an hour. And they talk about everything that has to do with their faith, everything that has to do with Jesus, everything that has to do with the one God has sent to make it possible for them to find their way to God, to be reconciled, to once more know that they are God's people, loved by God, as they've been loved by the one they followed here. Jesus comes among us. That's what the story says to me. We may not recognize him right away, but he's here. We'll know by what is done, not necessarily by what is said. We'll know by what happens, not necessarily by what is hoped for. We will know that he is with us even if we don't know right away. And I think that's the power of Luke's funny little story about going to a place that we don't know for a purpose that we're not sure about, to be met along the way by somebody we don't recognize, and finally, in the moment, with the hands on the bread and the words in the air and the loaf in pieces, we know that Jesus, our Christ, is among us. Now, at some point, as I have been, you are going to be on the way to the place where you go when things aren't going right. And I want you to be aware of who's along. You won't necessarily know by what you hear, but you'll know by what is done. And what you will know is that God loves you, that God cares for you, that God forgives you, that God accepts you, that no matter what's happened, God is ready to be with you, that no matter where you're headed, God will be along. No matter, God is there.